Welcome, everyone. I think we could do a little better than that. Welcome, everyone. Right? Awesome. Well, again, thank you all for joining this Hispanic Heritage Celebration here at Lehman. I am truly honored to be in conversation with someone who I consider a sister in the Afro-Latinidad movements that have been going on, esteemed journalist, just so many things. This is really a great moment personally for me, and I know for everyone out there, whether you're tuned in virtually or you're physically in the space, we are about to have what I would consider a very rich and layered discussion around identity, and want to give you, Natasha, a proper introduction. I know I gave a little spiel from my heart, but really want to let folks know the work that you've been doing, and I mean the work. So, Natasha S.Alford is an award-winning journalist, author, and media executive driven by the transformative power of storytelling. Natasha serves as Vice President of Digital Content and a senior correspondent for The Griot. Natasha also can frequently be seen on television, providing commentary on current events, politics, and social issues. Her work has appeared on CNN, The New York Times, The Guardian, Oprah Daily, Time Magazine, and Vogue. She is a graduate of Harvard University, Northwestern University's Medill School of Journalism, and most recently, Princeton University, where she completed a Master of Public Policy with a concentration in domestic policy and a certificate in urban policy. Natasha is the author of the award-winning book, American Negra, a memoir, which was released through HarperCollins earlier this year. To follow her work, you can go to her website, NatashaSAlford.com, or you can follow along on her journey through social media at Natasha S. Alford across all platforms. So let's give a warm welcome to Natasha S. Alford.
Thank you so much. I'm gonna move this over. I'm gonna try to make this not awkward for us. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, you know, that would be great to do.
Oh yeah, actually.
Yeah, we can.
That's way better.
Right?
So I don't have to
Great suggestion.
stick my neck to the side the whole time. All right, can you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Hi, everybody. Good to see you. Thank you for coming out in the afternoon to spend some time with me. I'm honored. I'm excited for your questions. That is always my favorite part when I do a book talk. And then I have the extra blessing of being interviewed by my sister here. So this hopefully feels more like a conversation than like a formal interview.
Absolutely. Yeah, for sure. And, you know, I think it would be great if we can kick this off with you reading a passage from American Negra to really set the tone and for folks to hear a passage from the book.
Okay, great. I had a couple passages pulled. I'm going to start with a chapter that's early in the book. It's called Mother Tongue. And there's a little argument that's happening, and it's between me and my mother. Shout out to my mom. She's born in the Bronx.
Yes.
That's like my claim to fame, that she's from the Bronx. All right, here we go. This is chapter 2, Mother Tongue. Morenita, morenita, men have named you. Not Latina, morenita. Negrita chiquita de Estados Unidos, writes poet Tracy Morris. Morena is Spanish for black girl, sometimes referring specifically to the medium brown-skinned women of any black ethnicity, including Afro-Latinas, or African-American women specifically. It could be a compliment or a curse. Mommy could not help me interrogate my morena status, my negritude, as she did not fully understand her own. She hadn't learned much about slavery in Puerto Rico or the black Puerto Rican leaders like Marcos Cioro, who had revolted and fought for freedom on the island. She just knew that she and we had African blood in our DNA. She knew that she had been called Negrita by her own mother, supposedly a term of endearment, but one that marked her as the most Black adjacent in her family, despite her mixedness. And so it would be no surprise that around this time in life, when I turned 13 years old, a primary ethno-racial identity started to form, a Black American one. I'm Black, I'd say defiantly, not interested in explaining myself to anyone anymore or having to defend my multi-ethnic background. You are not just Black, Mommy snapped when she heard me refer to myself as such one day on a car ride almost 10 years after our last incendiary road trip. I'm the one who gave birth to you. You are Puerto Rican and you are African American. Normally demure, Mommy was now worked up. Well, people don't see me that way, I retorted stubbornly. So I'm not trying to convince people about it. Our voices tangled and climbed over each other, leaving us both gasping for air during the argument. Voy a darte un puño. Don't get smart, Natasha. To me, saying I was Black was not about downplaying my Puerto Rican roots, but about rejecting a system that seemed to have rejected me by default. I didn't look like the Latinas people expected to see in America, and it seemed everyone had gotten a clear memo. Not only was it fairer skin that made you Latino in America, but the ability to speak Spanish. Back when I was in pre-K, my mother's friend told her that I would struggle in school if she taught me both Spanish and English. It was a wild claim with no scientific merit, but it was one that appealed directly to her greatest fears. Mommy struggled as a youth in school to keep up with the fast-moving English that my abuela didn't speak at home, and she walked around carrying a dictionary in class. She didn't want that struggle for me. So Mommy left Spanish in my orbit, speaking it around me and to me often, but English was king. And that's chapter 2, mother tongue.
Yes, which is so powerful in the fact that we're talking about various terms, right? Morena, we use negra, but then also too the fact that like when you assign these identifiers to yourself, what that means, right? And the fact that your mother, in knowing through her own existence what it could mean to identify in certain ways, making sure that she was setting you up in the best way that she could for the world, right? Mm-hmm. And so I want to kind of sit here, right, with identity. You mentioned your mom, the Bronx is her hometown, but the lineage in Puerto Rico via Bayamon, right? Your father being an African American man by way of the South, mm-hmm. And then you being raised in Syracuse, right? And so there's so many different elements essentially to your identity. And so I want to talk about navigating the world as an Afro-Latina growing up in Syracuse, New York. And how did you essentially settle on what you would call yourself, being Afro-Latina or una mujer negra, etc.?
Well, I think the meditation of American Negra comes from being asked constantly, what are you, right? It's a question that I think a lot of us can relate to, this idea that people need to know what you are first before they can figure out how they want to relate to you. And in upstate New York, even though it's Syracuse, New York, we know Syracuse is not New York City, not the same. And up there, it is very black and white. And that's not to say that racism doesn't exist in New York City, but because you are in proximity with so many different ethnicities, there's at least a general awareness that there are different ways to be Black, different ways to be Latino, to be a certain member of a racial group. In upstate, I found that it was very much, are you Black or are you white, or are you mixed? Right? Mixed, meaning that, maybe you have like a white mother and a Black father. But when someone encountered a person like me, they couldn't figure out how I could be both Black and Latina. And so the first question is, well, do you speak Spanish? That is the litmus test. That is the way that they sort of figure out that you are authentically Latina. But the catch is, so many of us as Latinos have been told we have to lose our language. We have to lose the accent. We have to speak English with a certain inflection and fluency in order to be seen as truly American. And so many of us, the second and the third generation, we have dealt with that pressure. Some of us have been able to hold on to it, right? And we've navigated both worlds. Some of us have been translators for our own parents, you know, sitting there in the doctor's office or reading documents and explaining. But I'm of the generation, the community, we're the no sabo kids, right? Where you sort of know Spanish a little bit, but you primarily it's been emphasized, you speak English, you speak it with fluency. This is gonna open up a path for you in terms of being able to ascend and achieve the American dream. And so when you're all of those things, navigating two ethnicities in an environment that is very oversimplified in terms of their understanding of race and ethnicity, and then you have the layer of, you have a language in your heart, in your orbit, but you don't quite have it on your tongue, that can be hard, and it can often feel like you're muzzled, like you want to say things, like you want to relate to people, but you're physically tied and prevented from it. I remember being in the car, and my aunts and my grandmother and my mom would all be speaking Spanish, and I know what they're saying, but I'm always the one that replies in English. So you almost have this position of being a permanent observer in your own culture. You're just there watching, not being able to fully participate. You're part of the family, but not like really part of, you know, certain aspects of the family. And it's, I think, a microcosm of the Afro-Latino experience at large, right? We're part of the family, but sometimes ignored, part of the family, but not seen, until we say something, and then people are surprised. Oh, you speak Spanish? How do you know how to speak Spanish? Right? For those of us who can speak fluently. And so, in the spirit of W.E.B. Du Bois, who talks about duality and a dual consciousness, being Black, being an American, and toggling between the two, not always being welcomed, being in a place but not of it, that is what it feels like to be an Afro-Latina. And so I wanted a book to exist in literature, anywhere, that represented that experience. It is not the experience, it's not the only experience, it's one experience, with the hope that we could educate and start conversations, and that, most importantly, that people who have felt like they weren't seen their whole lives could feel seen.
Absolutely. I know this is literally, as I was reading the book, a book that I wish was on my summer reading list. I think I shared that with you. As well as, you know, just a book, you know, through college or wherever. For me, it was just so important to see that mirrored, like that experience, that double consciousness, and also pushing against, I think, the sort of representation of what it means to be of Latin American descent, right? We know that it is not necessarily a racial identifier, which it oftentimes is socialized as such, and that you can be many different racial identities. You do not necessarily have to speak Spanish. You can speak an indigenous language. You could speak Portuguese, Creole. There's just so many different identities. But one sort of thing has been placed on 30 plus countries, which I think reading this, it was like, oh, yes, push against that, right? Like this notion of, though we're looking at your experience as an Afro-Latina, it is important that it, in my opinion, disrupts this sort of common narrative that we often see around our identity. So thank you for that. In chapter 9, I know we were just on chapter 2, but fast forwarding to Black Majesty, This quote really just like grabbed me, where you write, perhaps here is when my sense of American Negra identity started to form. I have been racialized from birth, called Negra or Morena by Latinos who describes me by my color first in this country and abroad, while also experiencing Blackness apart from the Latino community's conception of it, rooted in my African American heritage. That apartness had given me a unique positioning between two worlds, which is essentially the worlds that you were just referring to. And so I wondered, was this the origin for American Negra, right? As I was reading that, I was like, oh yes, this must be. But there was many other moments, but this really grabbed me. And so I wanted to know the title itself, where did that come from? And what went into choosing the title for this book?
Yeah, that's great. In chapter 9, so at this point, we're fast forwarding. I am growing up in Syracuse, which is a really high poverty town in upstate New York. And then I go to college and I end up in the Ivy League and I'm at Harvard, where my concept of Blackness is now complicated because I'm meeting people from different countries in Africa, the Nigerian Americans, and I'm meeting people who are also Black in other countries like the Dominican Republic. And then I go to the Dominican Republic, and it's there that I actually feel very American. So my whole life, I'm like, I'm Black. Then I get to the Dominican Republic, and I see, whoa, actually there's a lot of Black Latinos here, and Black people, right? I'm not talking about a little curl in the hair, and then they're Afro-Latino, like they're Black like me. But my Americanness feels so front and center. My privilege as an American feels front and center. Some people assume I'm Dominican when I'm there, but then of course once I start talking, they're like, oh, she's a gringa. And I'm like, oh, I'm a gringa? Like, that was a different experience, right? So how do you describe that, being of the Latino community, but also really being a true American, right? Americanized culturally, both in experience and privilege. But then, there was something about Negra and forcing people to say it. Like, I wanted people to pick up this book in the library and have to say the word and to understand the complicated history. And again, the duality of it's been used as a term of endearment, but how does it actually feel to be called Negra in a room full of people by someone who maybe isn't Negra or Negro, right? So to be called out by your skin color, and you think, well, I don't do the opposite for you. I don't call you Blanquito, just like as a term of endearment, right? So that, why am I being highlighted as like, why is that the odd experience? So there was that, but then there's also the embracing of the term. That poem, right, by the poet Victoria Santa Cruz, where she says, I'm called Negra, and then I learn to love it. And I learned to say, actually, I'm really proud to be Negra. So it was all of those things. I wanted people to have to say the word, to know what it meant, to know that it was complicated, but also to know that my American Blackness was very much present. And the last thing I'll say is that what college taught me when I did encounter different forms of Blackness was, although we were one and we were part of this larger like Pan-African community, and there was this sense of the Black community is together, there were certain stereotypes about African Americans specifically, right? There was a judgment, a sense that people who were Black American, descendants of chattel slaves, enslaved people, didn't work as hard, maybe didn't take education as seriously, that we lacked something, that we were missing something in terms of heritage or even knowledge of self. And there was a wrestling with that, like, ooh, what does it feel to be part of this stigmatized group of Black people at Harvard? But that wasn't specific to Harvard. I mean, that happens everywhere, right? And so I thought it was also important to claim that Americanness, because in America, what happens when you're Latino or African American is there is a segment of the population that wants you to not feel American, that wants to tell you you don't belong, that tells you to go back to your country as if you didn't help build this country. And so there was something about claiming that, staking my claim, and saying, I am an American, and this is my country, right? That I wanted to be part of the title.
Yeah, and we thank you for that because, like you said, saying Negra, right? I think at times it's like, there's, if you look at Latin America, there are so many different terms sometimes for saying black, and there's a lot of there's politics that go into all of that, but to affirm being Negra and all that encompasses is so important.
Ways to avoid saying you're black.
Right, yes.
Like if there's like 20 different terms, so you could be like, I'm not like fully Negra, I'm like right here.
Right.
Trigueña, like,
right.
Little, like not black though.
A little cream,
yeah.
coffee, like
right.
There's just so many things. And so you were starting to reference your college experience, and we do, of course, have students in the space, and just all of us, when we think about the college experience and how that can be so transformative and life-changing, I'd love to know from you, what was it like being at Harvard University in the 2000s, right? Because there was just so much happening in the 2000s as well. So can you talk about your undergraduate experience?
Yeah. Well, what was fascinating was I actually always wanted to go to an HBCU. I don't know if anyone else in this room at one point wanted to go to an HBCU, but what happened was the school that I wanted to go to, I'll just say I want to go to Spelman. That was my dream school. I couldn't afford to go. Like, you had to have a certain amount of money to go, or you would take out loans for the entire 4 years. And my mother, who, she grew up on Fordham Road, she went to Jane Addams High School, she paid her way through college with credit cards because her guidance counselor said, you don't really need to go to college. You should be like a secretary or something. And she was like, no, I want to go to college. So she didn't have the scholarships and all the support. She had to pay her own way. But because of that, she had a lot of debt. And so even when I was in high school, she was still paying off student loan debt. And she didn't want that for me, so she told me I could not go. I couldn't go to the dream HBCU. Ironically, it was Harvard with its endowment that allowed me to go to college for basically free, because it's not a merit thing. If you make less than whatever number they set, you can just go for free, right? As long as you get in. And so that was transformative for us. And so when I went there, I went still sort of disbelieving that I got in, if that makes any sense. Like, still questioning whether people would find out at any moment that I wasn't really that smart. And so I went in thinking I had to prove that they didn't waste a spot on me. And it created a lot of pressure. I made decisions not based off of what 18-year-old happy, free me would have done, but out of a sense of obligation. I must do the hardest humanities concentration that I can take. I must do this honors major. I must show that I can keep up here. And so I did have a great time, but from an academic perspective, I put a lot of weight on myself that at 18, 19, 20 years old, I didn't need to put on myself. And so whenever I talk to college students, like, I want to encourage them to be free. This is probably one of the freest, seasons of your life that you will have for academic and intellectual exploration. And it is okay to experiment. It is okay to do what you actually want to do and not do what you feel like you have to do. So that was part of the experience. But the other part was the beauty and the inspiration of seeing so many people of color there, because I didn't know that Black people, I didn't know that Latino people of all races went to a place like Harvard. My conception was the stereotype of, the rich white guy in a blazer with the boat shoes. Like, that's what I thought it was. And so when I got there and I saw that there were also legacies, there were like generations of Black people who'd gone there, people who were doctors, who were studying to be lawyers as soon as they left. I mean, just the excellence that was there. really opened my sense of possibility. Going to school with people who were like, not can we do it, but what are we gonna do? Like, what do we want to do? It changed the way I thought, because in my public school, there was always a sense of lack. Oh, we don't have the budget for that. We don't have the resources for that. And then you go to a school where they're like, oh, you want, $10,000 to go study abroad here? Go ahead. You want to launch this business? Go ahead. Like, that was different for me. So I talk about this in the book. I don't want to give the whole story away, but there is a chapter called Sell Out. And it's about what happens when you finally get a chance to make the money and to maybe fit in with some of the people that you went to school with, but what you lose in the process if you're not being honest about who you are and what your gifts are in this world. And so that's the experience that I write about in the book. The good, the bad, the ugly. I wanted people to have that so that they can make their own choices in honesty and integrity.
For sure. And, part of when I was reading about your experience, you talk about the access, right? And so during your undergraduate journey, you were able to start a woman-centered publication. You met other Afro-Latinos who had very similar experience, such as yourself, an African-American parent, a Latino parent, but also just Black diaspora in general, right? These students. You also talk about your thesis, which I was very fascinated about because, again, in the 2000s, it being centered on reggaeton, and that bringing you to the island itself, in Puerto Rico, and you just referenced, of course, studying abroad in the Dominican Republic, but to kind of go to your thesis, what went into, you choosing that as your center for your thesis work, and then also how has that sort of laid the groundwork for some of the work that you do today?
Yeah, I wrote a thesis about reggaeton. I really did. Which back then, that was not a thing. People were writing about, I don't even know, just it was not reggaeton. They were not writing about reggaeton. But what had happened, I was studying Black feminist theory, and I came across this artist named La Sista from Puerto Rico, from Loíza specifically. And she had locks. She wore African-inspired attire. And frankly, she didn't look like a lot of the women that you saw in reggaeton who usually were half naked and in the background, right? They weren't like, with the exception of Ivy Queen, who, actually was saying what she thought, a lot of women in reggaeton were props. And so was this me wrestling with feminism and womanism and what it meant for women to own their power, and then running into La Sista and being like, oh, that's what you are. For years, you've been looking for who you were, and there's a woman who looks just like you, and she is Puerto Rican, but she also knows that she's Black, and she's, proud of that. It went against all of the sort of stereotypes of the Afro-Latino who I know Black, right? We've all seen that little meme online, and it's like, that's not true. There are plenty of Afro-Latinos who know they're Black and who are very in touch with their roots and actually have a real close connection to the motherland through traditions that have been passed down, and she was one of them. So it was curiosity, which I think is what should drive all of us as students. I'm a forever student, but for my fellow college students, curiosity, let that guide you. And so once I did that, I got a grant to go to Puerto Rico and to work on the thesis. I wrote it, and I won't give away what happens in the book, but I'm glad I did, because it ended up helping me write this book 10, 15 years later.
Definitely. There's no coincidences, right? How things just kind of come full circle, for you and for all of us, really. Like, you never know, your thesis or work that you're currently working on right now could essentially be the road that you end up on. Right?
Anything you're doing now could be a book. I'm just here to tell you right now, I want the audience to know what you are writing right now is not for like fun. It's not just for your professor. Do it for you, because you can write a book, you can launch a career, you can make money too. That's always good. Hey. But this is what it's for. Like, it's not a dress rehearsal. It's like the real thing. Yeah.
Definitely. And so as we talk about your journey, move toward journalism in the space that you're, in right now. So, we have students with different majors in the audience. But for you, you've essentially worked at a hedge fund. You were an educator in DC. You thought about business school at one point. You went to journalism school, right? So you've had a number of experiences, right? And so sometimes I think there's this notion that you have to have a linear, path to wherever you land. But, you, through your many experiences, are a testament to the fact that, like, if you trust your journey, everything is going to lead to its rightful place. And would love to ask you about, can you talk about like the power of just trusting, yourself and knowing that you're gonna essentially land where you need to?
Well, it's hard, Janelle, because to trust yourself means that sometimes you have to not listen to other people. Very true. And we know that that's hard, right? Especially if you're navigating spaces that no one in your family has navigated before. Sometimes as a comfort, we ask a lot of people's opinions. And like, that's what I did my whole life. Should I do this? Is this essay okay? Is this what I wear for the job? Like, I was constantly getting feedback, but sometimes to the point where I lost my own voice. I lost my own sense of what I wanted. And I did careers initially that I thought I should be doing. Again, thinking about what other people would think. And I was turning, I want to say 26 or 27, going back from my 5-year reunion at college, and I was like, you never did the thing you really wanted to do, which was be a journalist. And so at 27, 28, I started over. I was the older student in the class, right? And that can be hard because, again, we live in a society that tells you as you get older, you're supposed to become more of an expert. But we don't talk about the value of being a rookie, of starting over, of being okay with starting at the bottom of another ladder. Because what's the point of going up, climbing a ladder that you don't actually want to be on, right? So at 27, I think it was between 27 and 28, I changed my career path, and it was the best thing I ever did. And I know people have class, so it's okay if you got to go in and out.
No worries, yes. And so right now, you are at the Griot, which I feel like when I think about storytelling, when I think about journalism, particularly centered around the Black diaspora, I do think of the Griot. And in fact, I feel like the Griot is how we initially connected through the Facebook Live conversation that you hosted.
About Afro-Latinos, yeah.
Right, which to set the context, like, this was at a time where, of course, Afro-Latinos have always been around, right? But the type of conversations that were being had, it wasn't in this way, right? Of like being super inclusive. You had people from various identities, but all being Afro-Latino. And so I share that because I want to say, was that like almost 8 years ago?
It was.
10 years?
Yeah, about around 2016, 2017.
Right, and so you were at the Griot when it was a lean startup, essentially, and being able to craft the stories that, we need to see. And so I want to talk to you about, or get your take on what it's like to be at a space like the Griot, just from professionally, and to grow, with your journey there.
Well, I think I'll give the headline first, which is do not despise small beginnings. So that is one of my favorite Bible verses. And I think it applies especially for young people or people who are on an educational journey. I went into journalism. As I said, I was, 27, 28. I was a little bit older, and I always felt like I was trying to catch up because other people were so much further along in their career. And then I got an opportunity to join this, startup website, but I wanted to be on TV. So I was like, should I go to a website when I really want to be on TV? Not realizing that when I took that job, it would actually end up leading to me being on television, right? And so there was a benefit to being with a smaller organization because it meant when an opportunity came up, frankly, I didn't have to compete with 100 different people to, try to go do an interview. I got to make more decisions earlier in my career, and I knew what it meant to build a media brand from one thing to the next versus joining a really established news brand. And so my hope in telling that story is just that young people will take opportunities even if they don't look perfect, right? Even if it's not at the fancy place that you really want to work or that other people say is cool, because it's all about the actual opportunity, right? Not what it looks like, but what is the actual opportunity to learn, to make mistakes, to experiment, and to grow personally. So, that's what I did. I joined this, website. We grew. We ended up having a national TV program called the Griot Awards, which was on CBS, where we honored Black excellence across many different fields. All these different movie stars were honored. And we really put out a positive image of Black people in America, which I think was really, really important. And we did it from a Black-owned company, right? So it wasn't a Viacom or a corporate entity trying to market to Black people. It was actually a Black-owned, family-owned, independent company, which was fantastic. And then, of course, I started doing a lot of commentary on CNN and appearing on television. And it was because of the work that I'd done at the Griot. So again, don't think that you have to go from point A to point B and follow a traditional path. Sometimes just by being excellent right where you are, people will find you. People will find your work, right? It starts with the excellence, and people will make space for you.
Absolutely. And you mentioning being on CNN, I feel like I remember the first time when I was like, hold up, is that Natasha on my screen? Yeah. I think it was so just impactful because though you are a skilled and esteemed journalist, also just seeing someone that comes from your community, a similar background, speaking on politics, and just commentating. For me, I was like, oh my goodness, right? And I have to just sit there for a second and ask you, like, what was that first time, being on CNN and just knowing that your journey and every step that you've taken has led you to that point?
Well, I was terrified. I was also 4 months pregnant. So talk about like really inconvenient. Yeah. I wanted to be on CNN forever and never got the phone call that I'm like 4 months pregnant, feeling nauseous every morning. And they call me like, oh, do you want to be on television this week? And I'm like, no. But thankfully, my fiance was like, you have to go. Like, you can't say no. So make sure you surround yourself with people who will push you when you want to, go inward, when you want to crawl into a ball, when you doubt yourself, and really it's the fear that's keeping you from doing something. Have those people that still push you. And so that's how it started, with a phone call, someone who saw my work on the Griot and passed it along. And I was very nervous, and I talked really fast. And I probably talked too much because I didn't realize that TV is all about sound bites, that you don't have to say a lot, you just have to say a little in a really impactful way. And even with all the nervousness and the talking fast, they called me back. And I said yes. And then they called me again, and I said yes. Are you seeing the pattern? I said yes every time. I showed up even when I was afraid. I showed up even when I thought I wasn't good enough. And you look up and then you're, officially working with a TV network, or people start to recognize that work. So how was it? It was terrifying. And yet it was my dream. And it came before I thought I was ready. And it came when it was so inconvenient, and yet it was the perfect time. So I encourage everyone to be open to what life gives us, to do things before you feel ready, and to realize that it's not perfection that is demanded of us. It's the effort and the honesty and the, again, integrity. I always say that piece is important. If you operate in those things, there's always good that can come from it.
I appreciate that transparency, and I think that is an overall theme, within your memoir, just how real you're, keeping it with your journey. And there was a part of this book that I felt was extremely important, and it was particularly talking about health, right? And you have been transparent about, your lupus diagnosis, and then how you had been navigating your career and wanting to sort of keep it possibly in the back end, and like wanting to keep going and to keep pushing, which I think is something that so many of us do, right? Where it's like we do need to show up, but we also may not be thinking of our health first. And I think that you speaking specifically about your diagnosis in the book and how you navigated that was really, really important. And I want to ask you, like, why was it so important for you to, push back essentially on ableism, right? And to discuss navigating lupus both, personally and professionally?
Well, those of us who live with illness, if we don't talk about it, we don't change the culture around it. Our culture's default is silence. It's hiding what we're going through. It's pushing through. Even if you're not sick, if you're a Black person, you've heard work twice as hard, and that's like a mantra. But sickness can bring you to your knees. Illness will humble you in the sense of you can't work your way out of it. You can't excellence your way out of it, particularly in illness like lupus. So for those of you who aren't familiar, lupus is an autoimmune condition in which your immune system gets confused and attacks the healthy cells and organs in your body. And it manifests differently for everyone. There have been celebs who've talked about their experiences, Selena Gomez and Toni Braxton. And it can really be a debilitating disease. And I think the hardest part for me is that it struck in my prime. So I had worked so hard. I told you I left my other career and I went into journalism and I moved to New York and I did all the things to get what I wanted. And right when it seemed like everything was working out, I was diagnosed with a lifelong disease that has no cure. So it felt unfair. I was in denial for a long time, and the denial delayed my healing. And so that's another thing I wanted people to know, was that the sooner you work through that process of grief and acceptance, you can get on to the healing. All those things had to be said, but I was sick at a time when the culture was still pretty quiet about these things. And particularly if you work in an industry like media, you don't want to talk about health issues because then people think, oh, then they can't cut it. They can't, show up. They might get sick. We don't want to take a chance on her. It's so subjective. And there is discrimination. And that's in every industry. So I thought, if I'm going to tell this story, I have to be honest and hopefully break the stigma. And particularly for my Black, my Latino community, to show them that diseases tend to disproportionately impact our community. And so we have to tackle the ableism. We have to show up and be there for each other. But also, we should know that you can still live a meaningful life, even with a diagnosis. You can still be impactful. You can still live your dreams, even with a diagnosis. So I hope all of that is healing for somebody who needs it.
Mm-hmm. Most definitely. When I was reading it, I was like, you know what, how many times, I had to sit there and question, how many times in my own personal life, do I push myself to the limits, right? And it's so important that we essentially, that pressure that you were talking about earlier, like we have to, of course, show up, but we also need to be very real and to honor ourselves in the process. So we've talked about a number of topics, and I want to transition a little to the Afro-Latino literary canon. So I know we talked about this a little bit, but before we talk about the canon itself, you as a published author, right? Wanting to hear a little bit more about that journey, because your work is essentially within the canon, but can you share about your journey, obviously being in journalism, being a writer, a storyteller, but this sort of new pathway that, you essentially are on?
Yes. Well, I know we're close to the audience questions part, so I'm going to save some of the answer for that because I feel like somebody's going to ask me about writing a book, which is great. I love when people do that. I will just say in short that I had a dream of this book existing in the world, but it took years for pieces to line up. Some years were just about networking and meeting people in publishing. And you email people and you tell them you have an idea and people don't email you back, right? But you just do that and you never give up. And then some years were for experiencing things. There were times when I thought I was ready to write this book that I wasn't. There were experiences I still needed to have, things I still needed to learn. So just because you want to do something, if it's not happening for you right in that moment, you must have faith because there's a reason why you have that idea. And so this book is a manifestation of that. And then in terms of the process, I worked on it actively for about 3 years from the time that I got the contract with HarperCollins to publish this book. 3 years. I thought it was going to be way shorter. I was like, I'm going to knock this thing out in 6 months. Life happened. And it was I felt like I was dragging myself across the finish line because sometimes the execution is a little bit harder than the idea. But when you complete it, there's no greater feeling, and it lives forever. It's work that is evergreen. And so that's the type of work I wanted to produce, so I'm glad I took the time that I did to do that.
Mm-hmm. And so speaking of the Afro-Latino canon, because essentially American Negra is one of the latest entries into the literary canon, when I think of the canon, I think of, the work of Dr. Marta Moreno Vega, who's also Afro-Boricua. I think of Miriam Jimenez Roman, who I know that you've, had interactions with and have, referenced her work while she was still with us. I think of Lehman's own Mariposa Fernandez. There's just so many. There are voices, but for you, how does it feel to now be among these voices? And also what you hope those that are picking up American Negra, whether they identify as, Afro-Latine or not, what they themselves will gain from your work.
Well, I will just say that I wouldn't exist without them. They've paved the way. I brought my books here just for shout outs. So Down These Mean Streets by Pirito Mas, classic book that I read before I wrote my book. And then, of course, the Latino Reader, which was edited by Miriam Jimenez Roman and Juan Flores. And it's just an honor. I wanted to write a memoir because I thought there was value in the interior dialogue, like hearing how someone is thinking and feeling. That's what memoir gives that maybe a history book doesn't, because history tends to be written, straightforward, this is what happened. And so I thought that memoir was a great vehicle for talking about history, but also taking people on a personal journey of evolution when it came to identity and self-identification ethnically and racially. So I'm just glad that exists for a young Afro-Latina woman. I didn't have it when I was growing up. And so as Toni Morrison says, if there's a book you think should exist in the world and no one's written it, you have to go and write it. So yeah, it's a gift.
So this concludes our, our moderated part of our conversation. I know that there are some questions out there. I'm feeling it like there are, right? I see some hands.
Yes, we see a hand. This is good.
So
this is good.
I can run the mic your way.
Hi, one of my students.
I wanted to just ask, what did you do when you got like a roadblock in writing your book?
Great question. There were times when I was like, why did I agree to do this? Because once you're under contract, you got to turn in something. And so it was because the weight of what I wanted it to be, and when I was looking at it, it wasn't that yet. But that's why you revise, right? And so when you are stuck on a project, just to sort of extrapolate the lesson, sometimes it's okay to step away from it, put it down, and I would go and read. Like, I would go and read other people's books. I would go to the library. When I could, I would just take trips. So because so many scenes and chapters are in Syracuse, I'd go to Syracuse to be present, close my eyes, remember, excuse me. And I would also do interviews. So when I had nothing else to say, I'd call someone else and I'd interview them. Do you remember this thing that happened? Tell me what you remember. What was it like for you? And just through sitting through the lens of someone else's experience, I would get new inspiration to write again. So there's a lot of working you can do on a book that has nothing to do with actually writing. It will make you feel like you're making progress, but also help you through the writer's block.
But didn't you say sometimes it's best not to listen to people, like when taking advice?
Yes, well, here's the thing. Interviews are not necessarily asking for advice, right? Interviews are about essentially getting a different perspective about what happened. And so I would say that, even with my mother and father, I write about them a lot in the book. That was the scariest part of being like, I said this about my mother and father, and they're still here, and they're gonna read this in the book. And I wanted their blessing, but I also wanted them to know that there were certain things that I wasn't gonna take out of the book. And so with my mom in particular, there were things that she was like, does that have to be in there? And she would have preferred that I listen to her and not keep it in. But I felt that it was important to the story, to the honesty of the story, because no one wants to read a book about how perfect your life is, right? There's no challenge in that. There's no struggle. There's no sense of victory when things go well. People want to read about the truth. And so I tried to balance respecting her privacy and the things that happened to her with the things that were true for me. And so there were some things that, she asked that I take out. I said, okay, that was something that happened to her. I can leave that out. I don't have to go there, or I can, modify the detail so I'm not as detailed. But then there were things that I had to listen to my own judgment and keep. So yeah, there is a balance. There is a balance. And that's why the writers and the truth tellers have to have courage, because it's not always easy to say what you think and what you feel.
If you have a question, feel free to come up to the mic. Yes, please feel free to come up to the mic.
Testing.
I hear you loud and clear.
Okay, that sounds good. So earlier you mentioned that you were raised in the early 2000s in Syracuse, New York, and that there were only like two races that people would identify as being white or black, or maybe a mixture of like a mulatto ethnic. Did you feel that there was like an overshadow with people who were Latinos who felt that it was like collateral damage to acknowledge that they were Latinos and they would like try to camouflage into society being something they're not and hide the fact that they know Spanish just for acceptance? Like,
Yeah.
have you felt this personally, or did you notice that around you?
That's an excellent question. And to clarify, there were people who knew that Latino existed, but their conception of Latino was Mexican, right? It's like they think Latino, they think Mexican. They don't think about all of the other countries that fall under that umbrella. People did know that there were Puerto Ricans as well, but there were not a lot of people who understood the history of the island. There were not people who understood how embedded we are in American history, like how far back we go, right? So I just felt that there was a lot of nuance lacking when people talked about what it meant to be Latino, and I think that's why they reduced it to simply, well, do you speak Spanish? Because that was sort of all that they knew. I have spoken with people as part of the interview process who said that when they were upstate, because Latinos, we have people of all different colors in our family. So lighter siblings would be treated a certain way, and then darker skinned siblings would be treated a different way, meaning sometimes they were discriminated against, sometimes they were followed in stores. And so even race would come up for Latinos who, we're all one, we're all family, but in this segregated North, the rules of racism apply. And the more Afro-Latino you were, the more that your experience differed from your own family members. So that was also something I saw. And I do think that for maybe some of the lighter skinned Latinos or even white Latinos who are upstate, it is easy to assimilate. If you speak English without an accent, people assume you're white like them. You can get a little bit further. And even in the book, I make it clear that my mom, she's mestiza, right? So she's mixed. She's not quite black. She's not white. But her that sort of ambiguity about her race worked in her favor because she could kind of go in between groups. But for someone like my father, who's very dark-skinned, there was no ambiguity about who he was. And so his movements were limited in the sense of places where he stood out. He's been followed in stores. He's been pulled over by police, right? And so I saw, even with my own parents, that their lives were so different, and it was because of race and perception about their identity.
That's such an important point because to be racialized as Black, right, that truly does inform, even kind of going back to the W.E.B. Du Bois, right, how you see yourself, how others perceive you, law enforcement, medical or healthcare systems, navigating that, being racialized as Black, even within our community, that'll be your reminder for sure.
And this is why, as much as we want a colorblind society, race is a fact of life, meaning it's a social construct that people have insisted on investing in and intertwining into the laws and the systems so that some people can benefit and others can be put away, right? And so it's not as simple as just wishing it away, because there's a truth we have to face about where we are as a society so we can actually solve it. Ignoring it is not the solution. And so that's, I think, what we're wrestling with right now. There are people who think that if you bring up race, you're the racist because you bring up this real fact of life about what you're experiencing and what you're seeing other people experience. And so in this era of anti-intellectualism and people rejecting those who go to college and saying that you're elite and saying that you're out of touch, I think we have to fight for knowledge as truly being power, right? And understand the power of it.
For sure. Are there any other questions?
Thank you to everyone who stayed. Did you have a good time? Did you learn something?
Yes.
Great.
Awesome. So I think at this point, I want to thank everyone for coming out or for tuning in on the live stream. Natasha, this has been such a phenomenal conversation. I can talk to you for hours and hours.
This was great. You were wonderful.
No, thank you. And then also I have to thank those who made this event possible, the Office of Communications and Marketing, the Office of the Provost, departments like the Media Studies and Journalism, Africana Studies, and Latin American and Latino Studies. So thank you all for that. And Natasha will be around. We also have books on hand. We will be raffling off a book, or there might be one lucky winner.
Well, actually, I'm going to give everyone who stayed a free book. Yes, because you stayed.
Do you hear that?
I'm
Those
going
of you on the live
to
stream?
donate. You will get a free book, and I will sign it. Thank you for staying and being part of this conversation.
Thank you so much, Natasha. We are so grateful.
I'm so grateful.
And for
Thank
being
you.
in the Bronx.
Listen, I had to come home. There wouldn't be me without a Bronx, so thank you.
Yeah, aw, thank you so much.
Awesome, thanks. We have to get a picture, too. Yes. All right.
Oh, yeah, we have a media team here. So.